Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival, Join the Conversation, and I'd like to welcome you from wherever you may be watching. Transforming the way that the festival is delivered, from live appearances to an online version, and offering an even stronger, more diverse and plentiful series of events, is a reflection of our belief that literature and the arts provide a catalyst for dialogue, creativity, empathy, laughter and tears, binding communities together. We're enormously grateful to all our speakers who've dedicated their time and talents to the festival. Please buy their books as a way of enhancing the festival experience. It's my pleasure to invite you, on behalf of my colleagues and board, as well as myself, to join the conversation. We hope that you'll do so in person next November, if at all possible. Charleston in South Carolina is a beautiful, historic and hospitable town, and the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival will definitely be going from strength to strength.
I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development for the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. This year, more than ever, we are so grateful to our generous donors, returning and new, who've made it possible to offer free sessions to everyone everywhere, building a truly international audience. There's still time for you to become a donor. We're taking donations throughout the month of November. So if you would like to become a sponsor, and we urge you to do so, please contact me using my email on the website. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Leah Ryan and I'm the Festival Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. It is my genuine pleasure to introduce you to a remarkable session today, and to do so from the stunning gardens of 20 South Battery in Charleston, South Carolina. Truly, this garden is a paradise brought to life. Love is a universal language. Author André Aciman has shown us that it's also as diverse and richly textured as the world in which we live. From youthful infatuations in the Italian countryside to the stormy longings of New York City, to gone but not forgotten romances that span continents, it is always stunning and it is always unique. André Aciman has truly traveled the world. From his youth with Sephardic Jews in Egypt to Italy to New York, he's lived in some of the most storied places imaginable. Today, he's the best-selling author of novels like Call Me By Your Name, Its Sequel Find Me, and a memoir, Out of Egypt. He's the editor of the Proust Project and a professor at City University in New York. Speaking with André today is festival alumnus and friend Bill Goldstein. Bill is the editor of the New York Times Books website. He is the book critic for the weekend edition of Today in New York, the author of The World Broke in Two, and he's writing the official biography of Larry Kramer. It is my genuine honor to introduce you to André Aciman and Bill Goldstein.
Hello, I'm Bill Goldstein, and I'm here this afternoon with André Aciman. I'm very excited about this, and I'm thrilled and grateful to the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival for inviting me to do this talk virtually. I've enjoyed my visits to Charleston the last 2 years and had been hoping to be there again this year in person with André, whose work I've always admired. And here we are. André is on the northern end of Manhattan and I am on the southern end, both on the west side. And we are talking to you from Manhattan and are glad to be here virtually in Charleston, hoping to be there in person at some point soon in the future. But thank you, André, for being here. And I'm glad to finally have the chance to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for the welcome. This does not mean that I'm not going to be invited at Charleston at some point in the future. Okay.
Well, I guess how we perform or how you perform over the next hour will be crucial to that future invitation. And I guess it's dependent on your writing more wonderful books that people want to read and have you talk about. So it's all up to you, I think.
It's on my shoulder. I see.
Yes, it's all
How I
about
dance. That's okay. I get it.
Okay. So there's so much I want to talk to you about. I think what I will do is begin with the reason that we're here, at least, the proximal reason why we're here, which is your novel, Find Me, your most recent book. And then we will venture widely over your career, your other books, Call Me By Your Name as a book and movie. And I hope that we will also spend some time talking about Proust, which I think is a shared love that we have together. So tell me, here we are. Find Me is a sequel to Call Me By Your Name. I mean, it was published in 2019, last year, and Call Me By Your Name was published in 2007. So I'm interested in what drew you back to the characters in Call Me By Your Name, and then how you thought of them 12 years later, and why you wrote the book.
Well, I wrote Call Me By Your Name initially in 2005. So we're talking about 15 years ago. And I wrote it because I was having a very hard time writing another novel that I was basically contracted to write. And at some point, I was at chapter 2, and I just couldn't go on. And so I stopped writing chapter 2, and I started writing in my diary another story because I wanted to be in Italy that summer. I wasn't going to be in Italy. I knew it. And so I just began something in my diary. About a page and a half or so later, I just sort of copied that whole section and pasted it on a sheet of paper on another document on computer, of course, and just kept writing that, figuring, okay, I'm just going to have fun with this for another 5 pages, and then I'll stop. And eventually it became 30 pages within, I think, 10 days. So it went very, very fast. And I said, I'm going to stick with this, forget the other book for the time being. And so I spent that whole summer writing Call Me By Your Name, which was 3.5 months. And I was done. And then I went back to the other novel. That was the point of the whole thing. And I presented it to my agent, and she said, so you finally finished the book? I said, well, no, I just wrote another one, but I don't think you're going to publish this one, but just take a look and let me know how embarrassing it is. And she called me the next day saying, do you want me to sell this book? I said, if you think you can, sure, why not? And she said, I definitely think I should. So she loved it, and the editor loved it 2 days later. And so we had a contract within 2 days. So it went very fast. The book basically stayed with me. It never left me. And if I wanted it to leave me, it couldn't, because people kept writing to me every single day. And they still do. They still write to me. You're talking about 15 years later, because people have basically absorbed it. They've reread it many times. After I finished that other book that I had put on hold, I decided I was going to go back to Call Me By Your Name. And I did that for a while. And then I realized this is not going to work at all. It's the same story, and I've just written it. Once you have two people saying they're in love with each other, or whatever it is that you want to call it, because I didn't want to use the word love, I figured this is moot. It's already happened. What are the difficulties? There are difficulties, geographical difficulties, marital difficulties. I just didn't want to deal with it. So I abandoned it. And it was only like years later, about 10 years later, that I was in Italy. I was having a nice time in Italy. I was writing another book. And I realized I should really go back to these characters. They hadn't died. I loved them. I loved Elio. I loved Oliver. I loved what they had. So I just decided I'm going to write about it, but I cannot write it the same way. It just couldn't happen that way. So I decided to write about the father who has a significant affair, and about Elio now with somebody else, not even Oliver. And then I had Oliver, who is by himself, where he's living with his wife, and things are not very hot between them. And suddenly he has this epiphany. And I'm not going to go any further because
we have to leave some mystery. I mean, one of the marvelous things about Find Me is that it is structured so differently, and it does not feel at all like a sequel or something that was manufactured to just continue the story. I mean, it has a life of its own. I mean, in the sense of you focus so much on the father at the beginning of the way the novel is structured, that it feels like a different world, and that was beautiful. I mean, the way it's a companion in some way, an emotional companion, but without being a follow-up somehow.
Well, I didn't want to do a follow-up. In fact, I never thought of doing a follow-up. I was just going to use the same characters at different sort of moments in their lives. And I had the timetable was more or less predictable, because I wanted to do it 10 years after the two lovers separate, 15 years later, 20 years later. And that arrangement of years was more or less predicted by Call Me By Your Name, except that I made a math mistake and I got the years wrong. And at some point, I'm giving a reading in public and I'm giving a talk, and somebody raises his hand and says, but if you do the math, by the time the father has an affair with Miranda, he should be dead already. So I said, you are right. I never thought of that. Of course, nobody caught that, and it doesn't matter, But I wanted to pick up the father. I was very interested in the father. What kind of a man would give such a speech to his son, which has affected, I can't tell you, numberless people.
Yes.
People use it to speak to their parents. Parents use it to speak to their sons. There's a kind of, and it was not my purpose at all to sort of create this sort of template for this is what fathers should say to their sons or daughters. It was just came that way. And I think the whole book feels, if I can say so, natural and visceral enough, because nothing was planned. The book wasn't even planned.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things that you've said so far I wanted to backtrack to. One is that this novel and Call Me By Your Name were, in a certain sense, distractions from something else that you were writing. And if you could just say, I mean, it seems very key somehow to your imagination, or then, what does seize you, that that they arose from a stall in something else, or you became distracted from your own work to be seized by something that really attracted you. And is that something that has happened to you a lot, that you're working on something and then another idea comes and that's actually what moves to fruition?
I sometimes joke about it by saying that I'm fundamentally a disloyal person. If I'm loyal to a particular project, I will cheat on it. It's because I don't think I can take myself very seriously as a human being. And so any serious project, especially one where they've given you the advance on the book, already feels like a serious project, and I need to break something. And that's what happens. But ultimately, I think that the rigors of a particular project are so suffocating that sometimes I need an escape valve. And the escape valve happens to be something that's not insignificant at all. It is significant, but it happens precisely because it is a tangent. That's not the real thing I'm working on. But then I think of my whole life, and I think that the most momentous events in my life have all been tangents, things that were totally unpredictable and sort of not even foreshadows or foreseen. And suddenly that's my life now. And I love that this is how things happen. And that makes of me a sort of a kind of closet optimist, because I'm not really an optimist. I don't pretend to be an optimist, that's for sure. But by and large, I think that everything that has happened in my life has been for the best. And I mean, I'm sure I'm going to get nasty surprises as soon as I've said this.
Right.
But this is how it's been. So a project that is serious and I'm committed to eventually will yield a subsidiary one that basically gets turned into a movie, of all things. And I never even thought it was good enough to be published.
Well, I think self-doubt might be a good thing. I mean,
Yes. Oh, that's how I live. Self-doubt is my emblem.
well, the other thing is that you said how you began Call Me by Your Name by writing in your diary and writing a page and a half in your diary. And I'm intrigued that you wrote fiction in your diary because you've written memoir, you've written novels, and you've also said that you don't think that there's really a difference between memoir and novel. So if you could say something more about that false distinction as you see it between genres. And then also there's something very personal, and we assume anyway that when people are writing in their diary, they're writing to themselves, and yet this was something that became very outward directed. So I love that there are so many contradictions in how it came about, and yet it seems that whatever paradox there is actually fulfills your vision of what writing is.
Well, I think that a writer cannot say that he is or she cannot say, I am a fiction writer. I don't do nonfiction. I don't do book reviews. I don't do this. You're a writer, face it, then you can do anything you want. If you're asked to write a sonnet that rhymes, you'll have to do it because that's what the job is. We sort of travel lightly, but we can do anything. So people will call a writer and say, can you do such and such? I know you've never done it before. Yeah, I'll do it, sure. And that's my attitude has been. So I never like, second of all, I hate the distinctions that are made between fiction and nonfiction, because I think that, first of all, a writer has, as I like to say, has only one song. You only have one song in you, but it is a song that you sing many, many times in various keys, in various moments. And sometimes most people will not even know it's the same song. You know it's the same song. So when I write a book review, for example, I'm still being André writing a book review. And when I write a novel or when I write a sex scene that is certainly not the official op-ed André, it is still me. In other words, the various voices, the various inflections, the edge that one has in one's voice is always the same. Mm-hmm. And we seek that edge. We don't even know what it is, but it will come out somehow. So, and I think that's important. As far as fiction and nonfiction, or memoir and fiction, I think that in fiction, we put a lot of ourselves in it. And it's concealed. In other words, it's not obvious that you've put yourself there.
Right.
And in memoir, you're supposed to put yourself there. And on the other hand, you also are making things up. Or you are, as I like to say, rearranging the furniture. The furniture is all there already, but you've rearranged it. And by and large, you do the same thing in fiction. So I have the extra paradox that people will say to me things like, when I wrote a memoir, they say, how could you write that when you weren't even born when that happened? Okay. And so they assume I made it up. On the other hand, when I write something in fiction, they say, this has to have happened. There's no way it couldn't have happened to you. And it had to have happened to you. So people want to see, want to locate anchors of reality in what you're doing. And usually they make mistakes. And the job of a writer is to fundamentally rob his life of everything and dump it on paper, whether it's memoir or fiction, it doesn't matter. And this is why I do not fault any memoirist for having lied, just as I don't fault a writer for having not presented himself as he should have done.
I like what in one interview that you gave, you talked about how writing hijacks the past. I mean, so in a certain sense, it doesn't recapture the past. I mean, you are creating a new version of it, even as you are looking at it.
Well, I believe strongly that you can take your past as honestly and as candidly as you want and transpose it onto paper. If you put a wrong comma somewhere, you've changed the past. And so punctuation automatically sort of precludes total honesty. You see what I'm saying? And so you
Yeah.
add an adverb and it's the wrong adverb, you've changed everything. And then you say something like, I liked it changed better than the way it was when it really happened.
Right.
Now you have to make a decision. Do I want to say it in the dull way that it happened, or the more exciting and refreshing way in which writing allowed me to embroider a bit? And I always go with the better version.
Well, what's interesting too, to go back to what you said about how you began with Call Me by Your Name, and then also when you came back to those characters and began Find Me, I mean, is that you said that you wished you had been in Rome and you sort of wrote yourself into it. So I'm very curious about the way in which writing works for you in relationship to geography, because so many, Call Me by Your Name is so evocative of the place, as well as character. Of course, your memoir, Out of Egypt, I mean, you evoke the place of the past and are locked into it also in the present. I mean, you evoke place as much as characters. So the place, I mean, this is a cliche, but place becomes a character. So how do you write yourself both into the past and into a place in which you are not present that way?
How do you do that?
Oh, I meant how you do it, just for yourself. But
No, I understand. It's a very good question. And basically, the one thing you don't want to do is to say, I'm going to recreate a place. And if you think about it, and I'll make a bet with you, go to Call Me by Your Name and find out how many specific moments of Italian landscape you can find. You will find there are about 5 or 6. And yet people always tell me it is filled with Italy all over the place. It's not that. It's just that the language itself, the cadence of the sentences, gives you a feel for something languid and almost too comfortable and summary and also passionate. That's not even described. I know that, for example, the house, I said 3 things. I said that the sheets smell of chamomile because they use a chamomile-based soap. Okay. That in the afternoon, you can smell the coffee rising from the kitchen into the 2nd floor. Okay. And sometimes you smell the combination of rosemary and lavender in the garden. That's it. I say nothing else. First of all, because I'm not interested in details as a writer, but I like to give you the feeling of the comfort that comes in being in Italy on an afternoon when you've just had a wonderful meal and you're ready to nap maybe, or have sex, one of the two. And basically, this whole atmosphere is conveyed to you by the rhythm of the sentences, not by the details that are the postcard moments that everybody thinks they're getting. They're not getting it. You're getting it in the film, very much so, but you don't get it in my book.
Well, so I like that you're as free from geography as you are from any way beholden to fact. I mean, whether it's in memoir or in fiction.
Well, I hate facts. I hate, and I've said this many times, I hate realism as a way of writing. I'm not a journalist. Journalists should be doing realism. Fiction writers have some other agenda. If you look at Find Me, there's a whole segment that takes place in Paris. It's the month of November in Paris. And the only thing I describe is the sleet on the pavements, on the cobblestones. And that's all I say about Paris. But suddenly you have the sense of the coldness, the dampness, the feeling of it's not winter yet, but it's going to be winter. And how nice it is to walk with somebody whom you feel attracted to and walk with them slowly on those cobblestones. That's the Paris that I wanted. That's all I want from Paris. That's the postcard you get. That's it.
and so that particular image, feel, smell, the smell of the chamomile, the smell of the coffee, do these bear the weight that they do because you've edited out a lot of other things, or are these the things that seize you and then you build other things around them. I mean, I'm just wondering if it's your books are often very short, which means to me that they've been synthesized in some heightened way, and yet these details feel so natural. That the way you describe them now, I mean, it's almost like chance that you came upon them rather than honing it.
No, it's totally by chance. I mean, I pay more attention to the structure of a sentence than I do with the details that I report. I mean, I don't care about details. I mean, there's one detail that I love is that when Elio and I forget the name of the woman, Marcia, they're playing tennis and they sit on a bench. And of course, it's the early afternoon and the bench is burning hot. And what a nice feeling it is to sit on a burning hot bench, knowing that it's slightly uncomfortable, but it feels nice.
All right.
And that's all I say. That's all I wanted. And usually my details are all bare on the senses without trying to be sensual or take myself far too seriously that way. It's just that I like the senses and I like the response of the body to various things. And I'm very alerted to that.
Well, so I'd like to talk a bit about what we're continuing here with the sight, the smell. I mean, of course, you have written about Proust and have talked about Proust a lot. I mean, is that something that sense of smell, that sense of taste, is that something that you learned from reading Proust, or is that something just in what interests you in writing and in life, so that's why you're actually drawn to Proust, or is it a lesson from him?
Well, this is going to take 1 minute. I promise I'll be very short.
No.
I'm walking in Paris. I'm probably 14 years old. I'm walking in Paris with my father. And we pass by a particular building where there's a stench of old pipes. And I say, you know what? The smell that I'm smelling of those old pipes reminds me of your father's house. And of course, his father had died when I was 2 years old. So basically my memory was immediately triggered to that. And he said, oh my God, you have a very olfactory memory. I said, yeah, I always smell things. He said, you should read Proust, he says. And so that same afternoon, he said, let's buy you a Proust. And so he bought me the second volume of In Search of Lost Time. And I began it and I felt it's too close. It's too close to who I am. And so I stopped reading it. I wasn't going to read Proust. But the fact that my father was also, he sort of mandated or sanctioned the fact that there was a Proust, a little bubbling Proust in me, as it were. So that when I finally read Proust, I wasn't reading Proust, I was reading me, which is ultimately what Proust wanted of every one of his readers. And that's what I want, that's what I wanted from my own readers, is that, and they tell me this, they're not reading Elio, they're reading themselves. And that, I think, is the mission of a writer. You can't try for that, you just hope it works.
Well, it's also, I mean, what you describe about your father and his recommending Proust, I mean, is there's something at the heart of Call Me by Your Name. I mean, the scene with the father's, at the end, his revelations to his son and his understanding of his son. I mean, it just seems like, well, here your father saw you as you were in that moment, I mean, at 14, and in Call Me by Your Name, the heart of that book, I mean, despite the romance between Oliver and Elio, seems to be the father's seeing of his son in that way.
Well, it's also the father, I don't want to say interferes, but certainly determines in many respects what's going to happen to his son. And in a way, my father, who was a very well-read person, I mean, he hated certain authors that I ended up hating too, maybe because of him, but he loved Proust, and he reread Proust in his old age, and we would discuss Proust together. And it was wonderful to have a father who understands Proust. So yes, there's a kind of intimacy that exists between fathers and sons, which exists between fathers and daughters too in my books. And I think the relationship with the father is very important, and usually sort of not quite ordained by our culture.
Mhm.
I'm talking about Western culture. We are much closer to our mothers, as I was, by the way. But my father was very important because he defined certain things. And my father was also instrumental in talking to me about sex. He was a very open-minded person. There was absolutely no taboo in his world. And so you could talk about things very openly. And so the conversation that happens between Elio and his father, or the father with Elio, actually, it was something my father would have said or almost said. In other words, we had very candid conversations. And I love that. I love the moment in which some sort of a wall, if it exists at all, is sort of lifted, some veil is lifted between two generations. And I think it's a wonderful relationship. I had a wonderful relationship with my grandmother. I mean, I love intergenerational relationships, and they're very important. And I've been very lucky to have had them.
Well, I mean, and the second volume of Proust, I mean, the heart of that book really, I mean, is the relationship of the boy to, the narrator and his grandmother. I mean, so, when you said reading it, that, even at 14, I mean, you were reading yourself. I mean, that's a beautiful thing to discover in literature, is something that you actually have in your own life, that seeing that relationship on the page.
It is wonderful to discover that what you have exists on paper or vice versa, but it's also even more important to say, I can imagine having had such a grandmother or having had such a father, or I wish I had had such a father, which is what people write to me all the time. In other words, it doesn't have to have happened to you,
Right.
but you're giving people a template for what they wished or could have had in their lives. And it's no accident that my next book is all about the might have been, which is where I think most of us live our lives anyway. We don't live our life in the present tense. We live our lives in some kind of different dimension where everything is should have been, could have been, and never was.
And this is a novel that you're writing, or?
No, it's a series of many, many essays, each devoted to various people, writers, musicians, composers, cinema people, that I misread them intentionally in order to read something about myself in them.
You said earlier that each of your books has come as a tangent, and even all of the important things that have happened in your life, your whole life has sort of grown out of tangents. And I'd like to ask you about a couple of those. I mean, you are a teacher. I mean, I don't want to say that you're an academic, because that seems not quite right, even though you teach graduate students and are a professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center. But so as a teacher who has a PhD, that was a tangent. And what I'm intrigued by is that you started out, and I'm going to say you started out in academia, and then the tangent that brought you to a completely different career before you returned to school and finishing your dissertation. Can you tell us about your career in Manhattan in finance? I mean, that's just...
Well, it's one of those weird things that happens in life. I went into comparative literature. I was accepted at Harvard. I didn't really want to go to Harvard, but I figured, okay, it's Harvard. Why are you going to say no to Harvard? So I went. I was going to do comp lit, but I was just pretending to do comp lit. Really, what I wanted to do was write novels while I was doing comp lit. And eventually the comp lit factor took over my life, because I really had to read a lot of books. I really had to write papers. I really had to do many things that I really wasn't committed to. And so eventually, after about 7 years, I quit the comp lit department. I didn't get my PhD. I was ABD. And eventually I went and worked on Wall Street. And I did that for 3-4 years. And then I got sick of that because that wasn't working out. And so I said, what can I do? And I figured, okay, I'll go into advertising. I had a fantastic job in advertising, which lasted about exactly a year until I was fired. And then I said, okay, this is a good thing. I mean, people always tell me this. It's a good thing you got fired. Are you serious? But of course, it was a good thing, because then I decided I'm going to finish my dissertation.
Right.
I finished it in very, very quick time. And then I got a job. I got a job as an assistant professor at Princeton, which lasted, about 7 years. Then I was basically not given tenure. I was fired, which was painful for about a day until I found another job right away at Bard College. And then I left Bard and I went to the Graduate Center, which I used to say from day one, this is the best job I've ever had in my life. Because when I took the job, I said, I'm going to teach Comp Lit, I'm going to be the professor you want me to, but I'm not going to be asked ever to write anything and publish anything that I don't want to write. And they said, fine. So that was a condition that I took the job on. And of course, the job for me was wonderful because it allowed me to be a writer who teaches and at the same time who can write anything he pleases. And I wrote more as a person at the Graduate Center than I did in my whole life before that.
I mean, it's so interesting because I mean, you say that you wanted to write novels. I mean, you knew that you wanted to do that. And before this conversation, I mean, obviously you're a marvelous novelist and a very productive novelist, but it was useful to stop thinking that because you were a teacher, you are an academic, because one of the thoughts I had before, I sort of got ready for this conversation was, well, what about, you have these novelistic gifts. Why have there been so many critics? And I'm thinking of Edmund Wilson, I'm thinking of Lionel Trilling, who, as brilliant as they were as critics, what they really felt would be the defining accomplishment of their creative lives was to write a novel, which neither of them was really able to do successfully. I mean, Lionel Trilling's novels, one novel, The Middle of the Journey, and Edmund Wilson's novels are not particularly, scintillating, shall we say. And yet it's so interesting to me that these great critics saw the defining achievement as somewhere other than what they were able to do, whereas you seem much more at ease. I mean, perhaps because this is what you had wanted to do, that writing the novel was what you wanted to do and you were able to do it. I guess I got a little lost in that, but can you sort of separate out your commitment to the novel from this add-on that other critics have sort of seemed to have in approaching a novel? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the more startling example is the French critic Roland Barthes, who basically wrote essays all his life and criticism all his life. Some of it more arcane than he would have wished, but that was the vogue in those years. So you had to be misunderstood and you had to be basically write in a language that wasn't always clear. But his real call was to write fiction. And he couldn't do it. He tried in various ways to write fiction, but he wasn't able to. And I think that the reason why so many academicians who know that what they're doing is kind of not really literary, it's paraliterary. They're writing criticism because they can't do the other task.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much like Leonard Bernstein, for example, who was a conductor all his life, but really what he wanted to do and did brilliantly was to be a composer.
Right.
And so, but he was able to do both. And I think that one has to, I've known many critics who say, I want to write a novel one day. And then they try and they fail abysmally because fundamentally they're not just academicians.
Right.
They are what you might call, they're professionals. They're not writers. There's a difference. And so they can whip up an article in no time on such and such and such, or a book review on such and such, or even a whole book. But the fact remains that when it comes to fiction, they don't know how to let go of real facts and go inside themselves and sort of bring out the fiction that they're trying to set. They want to turn the fiction into a classroom event, which is it's a dead giveaway. It's a terrible thing to do.
I mean, it's also, while you were talking, I mean, it occurred to me, Susan Sontag was another person who, I mean, I guess she was most successful as a novelist with her novel, The Volcano Lover,
Yes.
and then even In America, which are actually historical novels, almost like too wedded to fact, and yet, somehow, I mean, the divide between what she was able to do as a critic and what she wanted to do as a novelist. And so interesting that you bring up Leonard Bernstein, because of course, not only was there division between his conducting and composing, but within his composing, he was most brilliant and acclaimed as a Broadway composer, and yet he wanted and wrote classical pieces. But most people know West Side Story or
Yes.
On the Town or Wonderful Town, not Kaddish, I mean, which is one of his symphonies. But if we could go back, I guess, a little bit to Find Me and Call Me by Your Name, I'm curious, because of the movie and the movie's impact on so many readers, and then also a wider public, was it hard to go back to the characters as you had written them without seeing Armie Hammer, Timothée Chalamet, in Michael Stolberg in the parts? I mean, and of course you were in the movie. I mean, I don't know if you pictured yourself, on the landscape of, Find Me. But how did you return to the characters as opposed to the movie version of these people?
Well, then you have to understand something about me. I always say this, and I'm in good company because Proust used to say the same thing. He has no spirit of observation. I don't see. I literally don't see. And so that's why I have so few details, because I'm not oriented that way. Mm-hmm. And when I was writing Call Me by Your Name, there was a moment in which I had to decide whether Elio had hair on his chest or no hair on his chest. And I had to decide whether he was blonde or dark-haired. And I had to decide whether Oliver was blonde or not. And I couldn't decide because I couldn't see them. I literally couldn't see them. But now when I go back to Call Me by Your Name, I see Timothy. I don't see my character. And I see, Armie Hammer. The point is that when I wrote Find Me, where they're much older, thank God I didn't see the actors again. And so if there's a movie ever made of Find Me with different actors, I'm going to basically project those actors on my own book afterwards. The real fact is that I don't see, which is a weird thing to say, because people say, oh, you're so observant. I said, no, I don't. I remember one day I was in Israel writing a piece on Bethlehem, and I was with a photographer, and he would say, did you see this? Did you see that? You got to make a note of this. I wasn't seeing anything. He was telling me what to see, because I'm always looking at things as I imagine them, not as they are out in the real world. So I could never decide whether, there's a scene, it's kind of scabrous a bit. There's a scene when, after they made love, Elio is looking at his chest. And I had to decide, does he have hair there or not? Right. And I couldn't decide.
Well, I want to get back also to something you said about your father, and that you dislike or hate a lot of the books that he hated. I mean, almost as if literary affection or taste runs in the blood. I would like to talk about some of the books that you dislike, because some of them are very popular. I mean, classic books. You have quite a bit of dislike for Virginia Woolf, for example. And I'm curious if you could say where this dislike comes from, or why you think, for example, that Mrs. Dalloway is not a particularly well-written book. I mean, it's a curious critique. I mean, obviously there are people who don't like Virginia Woolf, so it's not as if you're alone in this. But I guess if you could talk a bit about the way you judge style, a writer's style, the success of a novel that you read, and not only how that relates to your own writing, but to the the visceral reactions that you have to books and how they shape what your interests are and what your tastes are.
Well, my father had never read Virginia Woolf, so he didn't influence me there. He influenced me about Balzac and Zola. He didn't like either one of them, and I've had a hard time liking them. I mean, for me, they're page turners. That's all it is. There's nothing really of great substance in them for me. But in the English language, which my father never mastered, I mean, he knew English, but he didn't really understand it. I like To the Lighthouse,
Mm-hmm.
and I like A Room of One's Own, and I adore Virginia Woolf's diary.
Right.
But when it comes to Mrs. Dalloway, I made a point of saying that this is not a strong book. It's a weak book. And I don't understand To the Lighthouse. And I've taught To the Lighthouse. But I don't understand it because it doesn't make sense to me. There's something missing there that I don't quite fathom. And I don't think she thought it through either.
Right.
You can't say that of James Joyce, for example, who is a very thoughtful man and thinks his work through. I don't think that Virginia Woolf had a clear idea of what she was doing if it wasn't just flimsy. I like E.M. Forster a lot. The one I hate the most is Henry James, because I find him, first of all, his sense of humor, I don't get it at all.
Right.
And I need a sense of humor in a writer. A writer has to get a chuckle out of you. And Proust does all the time. But Henry James, I find fundamentally, and this is going to sound awful, asexual, almost to the point of sterility. It all happens too much in the head, but it's not really in the head that it's supposed to happen. It's supposed to happen in the loins. And he has a hard time traveling south in that respect. And I always felt that he finds problems or issues that I think are sort of immaterial, but that's my personality. Whereas Proust finds problems that I say, my God, I've confronted this all my life and I never thought about it. So it's a question of sensibility, and it's just sensibility. I'm not sensitive to Joyce, to James, or to Virginia Woolf in that respect. But these are things that happen all the time. For example, one of the greatest writers of this century, I think, is Marguerite Yourcenar, the French writer, who wrote basically one great book. That's it, Memoirs of Hadrian, which I consider one of the most beautiful books. I also think that one of the underrepresented and undervalued books is Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited.
Oh, I love that book.
Which is a superbly well-written book, amazingly well-written. And I don't think anybody has surpassed that in the English language. So suddenly you have this book that is absolutely fantastic. And when you have it read, as I found it one day, read by Jeremy Irons, and then you say, my God, this is poetry. It's not even prose anymore. Right. So you go with what you really like and not what you should like.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Jeremy Irons, because he also did a brilliant audio version of Lolita. He's an amazing narrator in that way. Well, I think, I have so many more questions, but I think it's time, unfortunately for me anyway, that we should go to audience questions. So if the audience wants to post further questions, there are some that have come in. I have to pay attention to what you now want to ask rather than the many questions that I had remaining.
I don't see the questions, so you must see them. I don't.
Yes, I am seeing them. So Anne Blessing asks about the movie of Call Me By Your Name. She says, Rome is such a rich setting in your novels, almost like a character itself. Why is it left out of the film? I mean, I'm not sure that was up to you, but if you have an answer for that.
Well, it's a wonderful episode because there's the day that I met Luca Guadagnino and James Ivory at met at the same cafe. and they were telling me, Andre, we're going to make some changes to the movie, to the book. I said, yeah, that's fine. They said, well, that whole episode in Rome, when they spend that whole afternoon, evening in Rome, we might have to shorten it. Oh, yeah, that's fine, sure. Actually, we might shorten it quite significantly. I said, that's fine too. Well, to be very honest with you, we're going to eliminate it altogether. And I said, that's fine too. In other words, yes, Rome is central to, I think, to the solidification of their relationship, because that's the first time that they're alone without parents watching over them. Nobody knows them. They're okay to be a gay couple. Nobody's going to mind that at all. So they're open and freed. And it's the most beautiful part, I think, of the relationship takes place in Rome, where they don't even have sex for some reason. I love that. But I could see where that would have intruded on the plot as it was given in the film. The film wanted them to break up, and that was it. If they go into Rome, then it becomes an extra sort of fillip, an extra curlicue in the story, but it won't really, you can't materialize what's sort of totally internal in Rome. And so they left it out, which I think was a very wise idea.
There's a question from a person who wants to remain anonymous, although I don't think it's an embarrassing question either to you or to them. So, I'm not quite sure why, but to what extent do you draw on your background in Alexandria in your work?
In which work?
Oh, I think the questioner means in general. I guess it's a question about the specifics of the place, but also about Egypt as the place that you grew up.
Alexandria was, I think, you have to realize there are many Alexandrias. There's the Alexandria that I knew and grew up in, which was a kind of gray city, a city I didn't like very much. Although I was aware that it had a history, especially in my parents' lives, where the city was much more ebullient and much more European than it was when I was growing up. But there's also the other Alexandria, the Alexandria that I inherited through books, through Lawrence Durrell, for example, through Cavafy. And also there is also what does an Alexandrian do in New York? Does he become a New Yorker, or does he still have a vestige of an Alexandria? But is it a real Alexandria, or is it sort of a make-believe Alexandria? And I don't know how to answer that question. There's a certain kind of open-mindedness that you expect of Alexandrians. On the other hand, the only Alexandrian I know who was really Alexandrian in that way was my father. Everybody else was religious, basically close-minded, prejudiced, opinionated. So the kind of Alexandria that you meet in Lawrence Durrell did not exist, or at least I never got to know it.
Sandra Fowler asks, I was surprised that Ilya was the mover in the relationship. Her expectation was that it would be Oliver. And she said that could be the whole point of the story, though. That's what she says. Can you speak to that choice in your story?
Well, in that respect, that's how the story came to me. I was interested in an Elia who was going to be extremely sort of quiet about his desire. He was just he sees this man, and from get-go, from the very first line of the book, he's instantly attracted. And so he basically realizes that he hopes that the other person is going to at least like him as a friend, but he can't really hope for more, but he's constantly obsessed by him. The other one, as far as you're concerned, Oliver, is totally uninterested, doesn't want to do anything. And when he kind of intuits what Elio wants, he says, we can't talk about this. We can't do this. This is all wrong. So it is really Elio who's the mover here. But he also moves because he feels it's rather safe. Nobody's going to take him seriously. Nobody's going to say, okay, fine, come up to my room and we'll have sex. It's all a fantasy as far as he's concerned. But when there's a moment in which the fantasy could become real, he pushes himself. And I think most of us in our lives, when there was a moment such as this one, where we could easily have turned around and gone away, we said, no, you want this, at least prove to yourself that it's not good. And what's the first thing he does after they sleep together? He says, this was all wrong. I hope he dies or something, because I don't want to see him again.
And of course, that feeling is overcome beautifully in a lot of ways. So Virginia Beach asks, the definition of literature seems to have expanded in the last few decades, and I think we spoke a little bit about this in the sense of, you know, the vanishing line, or the fact that there isn't really a line in your mind between memoir and novel. But the definition of literature seems to have expanded in the last few decades. And she asks, what is your definition? Do you have a definition of literature that you can speak to?
No, not really. I mean, I don't know. There's something, I mean, for me, it's very simple. I judge a literary text by the first two sentences. I may be extremely and completely wrong, but it's what I hear in the first two sentences, the first little paragraph, that tells me, am I going to go on or not? Is this too specific, or is it too vague? Is something in that sentence that tells me there's a quibble in the grammar of that sentence, that I say, yes, that's clever. You know, there's something has to happen from the very get-go, because it's like judging a book by its cover, which you should do, because the author says it's okay to have that cover. And so if the author is okay with it, then he's also committed to it as well. And so you look at something how can you judge a book by the first two sentences? You should, right. You should really get to know the characters, I have no time. So and so for me, something that is literary is always rooted in the language. You can tell a master of the language from the first two sentences. If the mastery is not there in the sentences, then yeah, you're going to read it in good story. It's going to be great. You're going to be sitting at the beach reading it, but it's not what I want.
I love the way you've described, you know, the importance of the comma, the structure of the sentence, the way the weight of it hangs on the punctuation rather than specific details of the story. And I guess it's almost like a kind of emotion of you know, a vibration in the reader that balance causes. I'm amazed by the gift. I mean, you have it, other writers obviously have it, when you are, and it can come in many different styles, when in a novel in particular, but even, you know, in nonfiction, that in the first two sentences, the first you have an immediate sense of the characters, the people, and that is a gift beyond language, or even the language or style in which the characters are conveyed. And I always feel when I read E.M. Forster, for example, that from the first sentence, I mean, of Howard's End, I mean, when you are hearing about
Schlegel sisters,
right?
You know, when they write that letter, right?
Yes, exactly. We might as well begin, you know, with Helen's letters to her sisters, and you immediately feel that Helen exists. I mean, that Margaret on the receiving end of the letter exists. Then their aunt. I mean, all of this, but it really is from the very first sentence that the author conveys a reality that has nothing to do with detail, as you are saying. I mean, it's something beyond that you vibrate to almost.
Well, if you look at the first sentences that Jane Austen begins her novels, they're always masterful. I mean, she may not have determined this is going to be the first sentence, but there's something in the first sentence that says, well, I'm in good hands here, very good hands. Just tell me more.
Right.
And that's what you want from a classic. For me, that's what literature is.
There's a question, I'm just going to scroll back. Griffin Reed, who is writing from St. Louis, Missouri, or watching this from St. Louis. I don't want you to take the wrong thing from this, but he's writing a seminar paper.
Okay.
He has a question for you about your work. He is writing a seminar paper on the representations of desire in your work as compared to the films of Eric Rohmer. And
Oh,
well, I mean, so he wants to know what you think of that pairing, or if you could just speak about Eric Rohmer's movies, if you love them, or what your thoughts are.
well, I wrote a whole book on Eric Rohmer.
Yes.
And I love Eric Rohmer. He's my favorite director. And there is something about Eric Rohmer, especially in the first, what we call the six moral tales, where there is desire, very powerful desire, but always a bit sort of turning to be an oblique desire. It's not a frontal desire. It's always a bit oblique, a bit sort of almost misdirected. And it's funny because in all of Eric Rohmer's films, at least the first six, you don't have any sex. People don't sleep together, although they lie in bed together and they could have sex. But somehow it's not that there's a problem in the sexuality, it's just that something else occurs. And for those of us who've had many partners in life, you know very well that sometimes the best partner, something happens that foils the whole experience and you don't know what it is. And this person is, if he's at the Washington University or she's at Washington University, they should write to me because I have a student who's a postdoc at Washington U.
So Griffin Reed in St. Louis, you should write to Andre at his invitation, and I guess he will put you in touch with his postdoc student. Before we close, I mean, I've covered all the audience questions, but I wanted to go back to Proust for a moment, something you said. I think so many people who haven't read Proust or, have only heard about Proust, think when they hear the phrase about Proust and other writers, I mean, stream of consciousness, I mean, whether it's the right phrase or not, we'll leave that aside. Think that it is an intellectual experience that and what you've stressed here and what I love is that you're stressing the sensuality, the physicality of Proust, not as an intellectual exercise. The narrative is not an intellectual exercise, but based on some other kind of experience. And I think the way stream of consciousness is sort of absorbed makes people think that it's different, that it's a mental process that somehow is happening in the novel.
It's not. I think that we all live Proust. I mean, this is the genius of Proust. We live Proust. And there's that wonderful, you evoked it. I don't know if we have any time left, but the scene when he's with his grandmother and they're different hotel rooms. They're basically, there's a partition between her room and his room. And he doesn't want to wake her up because he doesn't know if she's asleep. And she is away. She knocks 3 times at his wall and basically says, I could hear you moving in bed. And did you think that I didn't know you were basically hesitating to wake me up? I can read your mind. So there is a partition between human beings. And yet when there is affect and there's love or something like it, that's very powerful. There are no partitions. The mother or the grandmother in this case can read what the son or the grandson is unwilling to do because he doesn't want to disturb her. Right. And it's these small moments in life. That's what Proust is. It's just miniature moments of life, which we all say, I know this, I've been there, I've done that, I've done something similar. This is me. And in fact, we all live lives, not in big events, but in small, tiny, insignificant moments. And I think that that's what Proust means to me. The ideas, Proust used to say, any book that has any ideas in it is like a very fancy antique with a price sticker stuck on it. You should never have ideas in a book.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end. I mean, we have ended on a perfect note. There. You don't look to books for ideas, but only for these emotions and these small moments of life. So I don't know if we should end now or just savor that moment for another few moments silently. But thank you, André Aciman, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
for to all the people in the audience who ask questions, and also to Charleston for hosting us. And we look forward to visiting with you in person in Charleston at some point in the future. So thank you very much to all involved in this festival.
Thank you all. And to that gentleman or that gentlewoman, I forget the name, they should get in touch with me. There are ways of getting in touch with me because the conversation needs to be continued.
Griffin Reed.
Okay, yeah, I don't have a pen in front of me. That's just weird. But Griffin Reed could write to me at my email. He'll find it.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you, André Aciman.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And you're on Grove Street and I'm on 109th.